It was a quiet Saturday morning when the letter arrived, but by the time I was done reading it, my entire world had turned upside down. The bold, impersonal words on the crisp white paper practically screamed at me: violation of HOA policy, unauthorized restriction of community amenities. I read it again, slower this time, trying to make sense of the absurd claim. The Homeowners Association was accusing me of illegally blocking access to a community pool that was, in reality, my own private pool. My own pool, the one in my backyard, the one I had paid for, the one that had never been at any point open to the public. My blood pressure skyrocketed. According to the letter, if I didn't remove unauthorized barriers and allow community access within 10 days, I would be fined $500 per day and legal action would follow. The audacity. I gripped the paper so hard my knuckles turned white, feeling my pulse throb in my temple. Was this some kind of joke? I had lived in this house for 6 years. I had built this pool 2 summers ago after saving for nearly a decade. I had hired contractors, paid for permits, and even checked with the HOA beforehand to ensure it complied with all neighborhood guidelines. No one had raised an issue then. But now they were telling me that my property wasn't actually mine. I stormed outside, still clutching the letter, and took in the sight of my backyard. The sun reflected off the crystal-clear water, the pool glistening under the light. A 6-foot privacy fence surrounded my property on all sides, ensuring complete seclusion. The HOA was out of its mind if it thought anyone had ever used this pool aside from me and my family. My wife, Sarah, stepped outside, noticing my tense stance. "What's wrong?" she asked, concern laced in her voice. I handed her the letter without a word, watching as she scanned the contents, her face drained of color. "Are they serious?" she whispered, flipping the paper over as if another page might provide clarity. "They can't be." But they were, and the more I thought about it, the more I realized this wasn't just a ridiculous misunderstanding. This was deliberate. This was the HOA flexing its power over something it had no business interfering with, and I wasn't about to let them win. Sarah and I sat down at the kitchen table, the letter between us like a ticking time bomb. "Who even made this complaint?" she asked, tapping the paper. "No one has ever had access to our pool. It's behind a fence, for crying out loud." I shook my head, trying to think. "It's gotta be Ted," I muttered darkly. Ted was the HOA president, a power-hungry control freak who had been on my case since we moved in. He didn't like that I ignored most of the HOA's unnecessary rules. He had given me grief over parking my truck in the driveway, leaving my garbage cans out an hour too long, and even the color of my front door. But this was another level entirely. "I'm not going to let them do this," I said, my voice firm. "This is our property, our pool, and no one, especially not Ted and his power trip committee, is going to take that away from us." Sarah nodded, her determination matching mine. "Then we fight," she said simply, "and fight we would. Because if the HOA thought they could claim my private pool as their own, they had another thing coming." I wasn't going to wait around for the HOA to escalate things on their terms. I was taking action first. The moment I finished reading their absurd letter, I grabbed my laptop and pulled up the original property deed. Clear as day, it stated that my backyard, my pool, and every square inch of land within my fence was private property. Nowhere did it say anything about shared ownership or community access. That meant only one thing: the HOA had no legal ground to stand on. But that didn't mean they wouldn't fight dirty. I had dealt with their pettiness before. I knew they loved to weaponize bureaucracy, filing complaints, issuing fines, and harassing homeowners into submission. I wasn't about to become one of their victims. If they wanted to challenge my rights, I'd make sure they had to work for it. I'd make things so inconvenient for them that they'd regret ever putting their noses where they didn't belong. Step 1. Build a bigger, stronger, impenetrable fence. The HOA claimed my existing fence was an unauthorized barrier. Fine. I'd give them a barrier they'd never forget. First thing the next morning, I drove down to the hardware store and loaded up on reinforced wooden panels, steel posts, quick-dry cement, and industrial-strength locks. If they thought my 6-foot privacy fence was a problem, they were going to hate what I had planned. I hired a professional crew to get the job done fast, and by the end of the day, a brand new 8-foot fortress of a fence stood around my backyard. No gaps, no weak spots, no easy access points. I even added a double-locked security gate. No one was getting near my pool without my permission. It didn't take long for the HOA to respond. The very next morning, as I sipped my coffee on the back porch, I saw a familiar figure striding up my driveway. Ted. He was in his usual smug uniform, polished shoes, pressed shirt, and an ever-present clipboard tucked under his arm. A bad sign. This was a man who loved drowning people in paperwork, and I had no doubt he was about to try and bury me in HOA violations. He didn't even knock, just marched up like he owned the place. I met him at the fence, arms crossed, standing firm. "Morning, Ted," I said, keeping my voice level. "What brings you by?" He didn't return the pleasantries. "I received multiple complaints about this obstruction," he said, gesturing at my new fence. His lips curled in disapproval. "It directly violates community guidelines." I smirked. "Funny, Ted, you told me my old fence was an unauthorized barrier, so I fixed it." He exhaled sharply, clearly irritated that I wasn't intimidated. "This isn't a joke. The HOA has determined that this pool is a shared community resource, and—" I cut him off with a sharp laugh. "A shared resource." I stepped forward, looking him dead in the eye. "Ted, this is my private property. I paid for this pool. I maintain this pool. I have the deed that proves this land belongs to me." He didn't flinch. Instead, he pulled out a new document from his clipboard. "Per HOA regulations, any recreational facilities that add significant property value must be accessible to all association members. Your pool meets that qualification." He smiled, clearly enjoying himself. "You've been in violation since the day it was installed." I snatched the paper from his hands and skimmed it. It was nonsense. A vague blanket rule that they were twisting to fit their agenda. But one thing was clear: they weren't backing down. "I'll tell you what, Ted," I said, handing the paper back. "If you want to use my pool so badly, go ahead, buy my house. Otherwise, stay off my property." His smirk faltered. For the first time, I saw real frustration cross his face. He wasn't used to being challenged. He was used to people rolling over. "This isn't over," he said, turning on his heel. I didn't reply. I just watched as he stormed back to his car, tires screeching as he sped away. But I knew he wasn't bluffing. If Ted and the HOA wanted to play dirty, I needed to be ready for whatever came next. And I didn't have to wait long. That night, as Sarah and I settled in to watch a movie, a loud bang echoed from the backyard. Then another. Then the unmistakable sound of wood splintering. My stomach dropped. I bolted to the back door, threw it open, and froze. 3 men, Ted and 2 of his lackeys, stood by my brand new fence, crowbars in hand, ripping it apart. The once pristine wood now lay in shattered piles on the ground. My blood boiled. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" I bellowed, storming outside. Ted didn't even look guilty. He dusted off his hands and turned to me with a mocking smile. "Removing an unauthorized structure," he said smoothly. "You were warned." Sarah ran up behind me, her voice shaking. "You can't just destroy our property." Ted shrugged. "We can if it violates HOA regulations." I clenched my fists, barely resisting the urge to knock that smug look off his face. "That was trespassing and destruction of private property, Ted. You just committed a crime." He laughed, "Sue me." "Oh, I would." I whipped out my phone and snapped photos of the damage, making sure to get Ted and his accomplices in the frame. "You just made the biggest mistake of your life," I said. Ted chuckled, clearly unconcerned. "You're not going to win this, Martin. You're one guy. We're the HOA, and we always win." I smiled, a slow, dangerous smile. "We'll see about that." That night I made 2 calls. The first to my lawyer. The second to a contractor, because if Ted thought tearing down my fence was the end of this, he was in for a nasty surprise. By the time the sun rose, my plan was already in motion. If Ted and the HOA wanted a war, they were about to get one. I was done playing defense. Ted and the HOA thought they could bully me into submission, but they had underestimated just how far I was willing to go to protect what was mine. They had trespassed on my property, destroyed my fence, and outright threatened me with legal action. Well, they were about to find out that I wasn't the kind of man who backed down. I was going to make them regret ever picking this fight. The morning after the attack on my fence, I met with Linda Carter, the sharpest real estate attorney I could find. She was a no-nonsense woman with a reputation for dismantling HOAs that overstepped their boundaries. As I laid out my case, the illegal letter, the threats, the property damage, and the HOA's attempt to seize control of my private pool, she leaned back in her chair, a smirk forming on her lips. "Well, well," she mused, flipping through the evidence I had gathered. "Looks like your HOA has been playing dirty." "You don't know the half of it," I muttered. "Oh, I think I do," she said, tapping a document. "And lucky for you, they just gave us everything we need to burn them to the ground." I leaned forward, intrigued. "They think they have power," she continued. "But the thing about HOAs is that they're not above the law. There are strict limitations on what they can enforce, and their attempt to claim your privately owned pool as a shared resource is legally unsound. They don't have a leg to stand on." I felt the first wave of relief wash over me, but Linda wasn't finished. "I'm going to do you one better," she said, her smile growing sharper. "We're not just going to defend you against their claims, we're going to hit them with a counter-lawsuit." I blinked. "A counter-lawsuit?" She nodded. "The HOA illegally damaged your property, trespassed on your land, and engaged in harassment. They have broken multiple laws, and we're going to make them pay for it." I grinned. Now we were talking. Linda wasted no time. By the end of the week, we had officially filed our lawsuit against Ted and the HOA board, claiming damages for trespassing, destruction of private property, and emotional distress. The moment Ted got wind of it, the panic set in. I knew this because, within 24 hours, I had an email from Ted's lawyer, begging for an amicable resolution. I ignored it. The next day, a certified letter arrived from the HOA, offering to drop all fines and restore my fence at their expense if I agreed to withdraw my lawsuit. I shredded it. They weren't getting off that easy. Ted had spent years terrorizing people in the neighborhood, using scare tactics, loopholes, and petty fines to get his way. But now, he was on the other side of the fight. And I was about to bury him. The courtroom showdown. 2 weeks later, the courtroom was packed. Ted sat across from me at the defendant's table, flanked by his legal team, looking pale and jittery. For the first time since this mess started, he wasn't smirking. Linda and I sat at our own table, calm, confident, and completely prepared. The judge, an older man with a reputation for despising overreaching HOAs, wasted no time. "Let's get straight to the point," he said, scanning the documents before him. "The plaintiff," he gestured toward me, "has provided extensive evidence that the HOA has falsely claimed ownership over private property, engaged in intimidation tactics, destroyed a legally constructed fence, and issued fines without proper legal basis." He turned his sharp gaze to Ted's team. "Mr. Thompson, would you care to explain why this HOA believes it has the right to seize a privately owned pool?" Ted's lawyer, a jittery-looking man in an ill-fitting suit, cleared his throat. "Your Honor, the HOA has long maintained that recreational facilities in the neighborhood should be shared resources, and we have multiple complaints from homeowners who feel." The judge cut him off. "I don't care what the homeowners feel. I care what the law says. And from what I see here, your HOA has no legal claim over the plaintiff's property." Ted shifted in his seat, his jaw tightening. He knew He knew it was over. But I wasn't done. Your Honor, Linda said smoothly, standing up. Not only has the HOA overstepped its boundaries, but we have also provided photographic evidence and eyewitness testimonies proving that Mr. Thompson personally led a group onto my client's property and destroyed his legally installed fence. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Ted stiffened. The judge turned back to Ted, his eyes narrowing. Is this true, Mr. Thompson? Ted's mouth opened and closed. No words came out. His lawyer scrambled to recover. Your Honor, my client was simply enforcing the HOA's guidelines. The judge slammed his gavel. He was committing vandalism and trespassing, not enforcing anything. He exhaled sharply, shaking his head. I've seen a lot of HOA overreach cases, but this is one of the worst. Then he turned to me. Mr. Martin, you are fully within your rights to keep your property private. The HOA's claims are invalid, and your fence was completely legal. Then came the best part. Furthermore, the judge continued, I am ordering the HOA to pay for the full restoration of your property and a sum of $50,000 in damages for harassment, legal fees, and property destruction. Silence. Then, from across the courtroom, I heard the sharp intake of breath as Ted realized what had just happened. He had lost. Not just a little, he had lost spectacularly. Ted shot up from his seat. Your Honor, that's outrageous. The judge's gavel slammed again. Sit down, Mr. Thompson, before I find you in contempt of court. Ted sat down hard. Victory. I walked out of the courtroom a free man. My property was secure, my pool was mine, and the HOA had just been humiliated in front of everyone. Ted, on the other hand, he was finished. By the time the dust settled, the HOA board had no choice but to remove him from his position. Even better, half the neighborhood turned against the HOA, realizing that if they had tried to pull this stunt with me, they could have done it to anyone. Ted tried one last time to save face, sending a pathetic email asking if we could settle things civilly. I sent back a single-word response, no. That was the last I ever heard from him. A week later, I sat by my pool, beer in hand, watching the sunset. My fence was back up, asterisk stronger than ever, and Ted was nothing more than a bad memory. The HOA had tried to take my pool, but they had learned the hard way. You don't mess with a man who knows what's his.